Doctors with disabilities exist in small but measurable numbers. How did they navigate their journey? What were the challenges? What are the benefits to patients and to their peers? What can we learn from their experiences? My name is Lisa Meeks, and I'm thrilled to bring you the Docs with Disabilities podcast. Join me as I interview docs, nurses, psychologists, OTs, PTs, pharmacists, dentists, and the list goes on. I'll also be interviewing the researchers and policymakers that ensure medicine remains an equal opportunity profession. This episode features a live recording from the April 2024 Docs with Disabilities podcast panel, Breaking Barriers, Redefining Technical Standards for Disability Inclusion in Canadian Medical Education. This was recorded at the International Congress on Academic Medicine in Vancouver, British Columbia. During the event, the panelists discussed the need to reevaluate technical standards that promote inclusivity and diversity, sharing their personal experiences. Together, they envision a future where medical education in Canada is transformed to be more inclusive of individuals with disabilities. And now, on to our panel.
This podcast is coming to you from Vancouver, British Columbia. In the spirit of truth, reconciliation, friendship, and reciprocity, we would like to acknowledge that we are on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Coast Salish peoples, including the territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. This place is a testament to the enduring presence and resilience of Indigenous peoples, and we honor their deep connection to these lands and waters.
Well, good afternoon. What a privilege, first of all, to be in Vancouver. This is a beautiful city, and I'm just mesmerized. I'm at risk of an accident as I'm navigating the city because I just can't stop looking and feeling the beauty and the warmth of both the city and the people here today. So thank you so much. I also want to thank ICAM for inviting us to do this, and this is a really important topic. We have two podcast episodes that will be recorded live. This one today that focuses on a new initiative on technical standards, and then one tomorrow that looks at the research in medical education, where we've been in Canada and where we are going. What you would say the process has been. So we're very, very excited to be here, and as always, it's just lovely to work with everyone that is doing such great work in disability inclusion here in Canada. So my name is Lisa Meeks, and I am the co-host and founder of the Docs with Disabilities podcast. And the Docs with Disabilities initiative unapologetically looks to diversify the workforce and include individuals with disabilities as our next generation of healthcare providers. And so one way that we help to fight stigma and fight ableism is by sharing stories. So we're taking back the narrative and reframing disability as a positive and something to be really excited about as we look to reduce healthcare disparities. And we also look to provide an opportunity for people who are well-positioned to be amazing healthcare providers, as we offer them the opportunity to do that in welcoming and inclusive training environments. So I'm going to ask our panel here to introduce themselves.
My name is Julia Haynes. I'm a third-year resident at University of British Columbia in the Physical Medicine and Rehabilitation program. I acquired a disability in high school and have left spastic hemiparesis as a result. So I've negotiated the entirety of my undergraduate education and medical education, now residency, with this disability. And it's brought a ton of challenges and also a ton of really rewarding clinical experiences and opportunities like this. So I'm very much looking forward to this podcast today.
Hi everyone, my name is Rachel Giddings. I am a second-year medical student at the University of British Columbia. And I am a member of the working group that was working on this project. I started doing some research under Dr. Cheryl Holmes, looking at the technical standards in my first year of medical school. and then continued on because I enjoyed it so much in my second year of medical school.
Great. Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming. My name is Cheryl Holmes. I am an Associate Dean of Undergraduate Medical Education at the University of British Columbia, and I'm also an advocate and an ally for persons with disability inclusion in medical education.
Wonderful. And Cheryl, do you want to show the entire working group? It was a fairly large team Cheryl assembled. And so we just wanted to acknowledge kind of the breadth and depth of representation that was on this panel that we're going to be talking about today. It was pretty remarkable.
I just want to thank the incredibly thoughtful and dedicated people who have contributed to this project. So many are here, Dr. Lynn Ashdown, Dr. Laura Yvonne Bulk, Dr. Quinton Clark, Dr. Laura Farrell, Miss Rachel Giddings, Dr. Lisa Graves, Dr. Julia Ursilia Haynes, Dr. George Kim, Dr. Naomi Lear, Dr. Michael Kwan, Dr. Salim Razak, at the back there, Dr. Franco Rizzuti, Dr. Ginger Ruddy, Dr. Alex Scott, Melissa Shaheen, Dr. Irene Stergiopoulos, and Dr. Lee Toner. And special thanks to our legal team, Casey Kren, LLB, and Meredith Holmes, my daughter, LLB, Dr. Sarah Knitter from the UBC Center for Accessibility, and of course, Anita Janusik, who kept us all organized.
And Cheryl, you have an interesting connection, a really special connection to disability. Do you want to talk about that for a minute?
So I'm dedicating this episode to my uncle Eugene Reimer. So polio left Uncle Eugene paraplegic at an early age with only minimal use of his legs, and yet he quickly became one of Canada's all-round athletes. He dominated international wheelchair sports in the late 60s and 70s, and Julia plays on the Vancouver Cable Cars, which is a wheelchair basketball team that he played on. He won over 50 national and 22 international medals, 10 of which were Olympic. And in his second Paralympic game in Germany, he captured gold in both discus and pentathlon, setting 2 new world records. So some of his accomplishments include being the first person with a disability to be named Canadian Outstanding Male Athlete of the Year, induction into the Order of Canada, the BC Sports Hall of Fame, the Terry Fox Hall of Fame, which has now created a Eugene Reimer Award. He also chaired the British Columbia Disability Games in 2002. But more importantly, and you won't find this on Wikipedia, on a personal level, for most of his working career, and he worked as a draftsman and a contractor, he would visit the G.F. Strong Spinal Cord Rehabilitation Center in Vancouver and meet with people with new spinal cord injuries and introduce them to life after spinal cord injury and to wheelchair sports. And one of those people that he influenced was Rick Hansen, who went on to raise $26 million for spinal cord research in his Man in Motion tour, during which he wheeled his way around most of the countries in the world. He also formed the Rick Hansen Foundation, which continues to be a major funder of spinal cord research. And he continues to also be a tremendous advocate for persons with mobility issues. So for me and for everyone whose life Uncle Eugene touched, someone being in a wheelchair and living a rich and meaningful life is just normal.
Absolutely. And I think we can all, and we'll get to this a little later, I think we can all see the connection, right? This was very normalized for Dr. Holmes, and as such, she's been able to advocate and use her position to improve access in Canada. So how many of you know what technical standards are, just by a quick acknowledgement in some way? And when we think about technical standards, we often think about physical disabilities, and we often think about individuals who are deaf and hard of hearing or who have low vision, right? This is actually a small group in the representation that we have, but technical standards most directly impact this group. And Julia, you were impacted certainly by technical standards. Can you talk to us about that and talk about why this is perhaps a full circle moment for you?
Yeah, absolutely. So as I said, I acquired my disability when I was in high school, and I just 5 years afterwards, I was accepted into medical school, and I was so excited. I very quickly filled out all of my admission paperwork, but in that time, I unwittingly actually signed an agreement about the technical standards. So, being keen, I really wanted to get ahead of things. I knew that there would be some things in medical school that would just be challenging with my upper extremity impairment and the fact that I used a chair. I reached out to the accommodations office and was very transparent. I told my story. I told, the details of my disability, thinking that we were going to work together to figure out how I would be able to accomplish things, and ultimately that, trying to negotiate what needed to be done and what didn't. I think in large part because of the fear of disability, because of the fact that unlike Cheryl, who has such an intimate and personal relationship with disability, we just don't have that broadly in medicine. So the technical standards were used to try and justify my exclusion. I was asked, not to show up on the first day of school. I was provided a list of, 200 items, some of which I ended up learning how to do one-handed. So starting IVs, intubating, it was a bit unfounded. And then some, two-handed knot ties, for example, that really were outside of the scope of a medical student needing to do to complete medical education. That was a really trying time for me and impacted me personally, my confidence, my sense of self. So much of my medical school was shaped by that initial technical standards justification of exclusion. So when Cheryl invited me to be a part of this working group, I was so excited to change these technical standards to core competencies and work with educators across the country to do so. When we finally got this approval from the AFMC, I can't explain to you how excited I was. I cried at my desk. It brought me a lot of hope that, people with disabilities coming forward wouldn't have the same experience that I did, and really reinvigorated a lot of this work that I'm trying to do to increase the number of people with disabilities across the spectrum of disability, from mobility, sensory disabilities, within medical education environments.
And I know your story, and I'm sitting here tearing up again for the second time. We have a Canadian series that is on the podcast, so we really encourage you to connect with that series and all of those episodes. Cheryl, you're a force to start with, so Dr. Holmes. What was the driver for this? You brought together, as we saw, this incredible community. What was the driver? What initiated this?
Well, I'm a little embarrassed to say that as a new undergraduate dean, I'd never heard of technical standards, and I didn't even know what they were, much less who they were used by and for what purpose. So when I first heard about them, I thought, oh, this is kind of interesting. So a bunch of us at UBC took a course by Jane Cheryl, who introduced us to legislation and some very high-profile American cases involving persons with disabilities who were prevented from entering health professions by technical standards. So essentially what Julia's saying, using technical standards is a barrier. And as I listened to these case histories, it struck me how uninformed we are as medical educators regarding the abilities of persons with disabilities and the assumptions that we make around what they can and cannot do. And so while it's necessary to inform students about what the skills, abilities, and behavioral expectations are going into the program, I learned that ours needed extensive revision. So at UBC, we were prepared to take on this project, and then COVID-19 hit, and it had to be halted by the imperative to keep the medical school running, and including our commitment to graduating competent new doctors during a worldwide pandemic.
So I love this. I love how you come into this role, you identify these technical standards and start to question them immediately. I can't help but think this is informed by your personal experience and knowledge of what people with disabilities can do, certainly. But then you don't stop there. You decide to take this across Canada. Tell us how you made this a Canada-wide event and project?
Well, I don't take credit for that idea, but at UBC, I think it was Laura Farrell, who was our Associate Dean Student Affairs, and I thought, we're going to go to a lot of work to get this done at UBC, so maybe we should float it at a national level. So at one of these meetings, the former Canadian Conference on Medical Education, the undergrad deans have breakfast with the student affairs deans. And so at the very end of the meeting, with about 20 minutes left, I kind of floated the idea, and a bunch of people put up their hands and said, yeah, we're interested in doing this. So we formed a working group, and it grew kind of organically with wide representations. I have to give a shout out to the AFMC, the people from the Committee on Social Accountability, Salim Razak from the EDI and Anti-Racism Committee came on board. The executive of persons with Canadian Association of Physicians with Disabilities, so Quentin Clark and Franco Rizzuti came on board, and other scholars and educators in disability inclusion, learners, so Julia and Rachel, and folks from the UBC Center for Accessibility. And we also needed to also recruit a couple of lawyers to help interpret what we were learning about the many legislative and case law in Canada and pertaining to persons with disabilities and postgraduate or post-secondary education.
Well, they say it takes a village, and you really formed a village. And I love how you leaned into everyone's expertise. There was lots of representation, disability representation at that table, literally, figuratively. And then we have Rachel. What did it feel like to be a new student, to be asked to be included in this? What was that like for you? Tell us what you did.
So I did a little bit of my own research into technical standards because, unfortunately, I also was not aware that what technical standards were or how they were used by medical schools in general. So I did a lot of research onto that to educate myself. And then part of what I did for the working group was pulling together the Canadian legislation and the case laws associated with people with disabilities and their rights to equitable access to post-secondary education. And I went through all the legislation and pulled what was relevant, and then thankfully with the help of our lawyers, because I was reading through it and I realized I did not know how to read legal jargon. But I was able to decide what was mostly relevant. And I think it was really important to bring this legal side of things and just communicate it with the group in general, because a lot of medical leaders and educators are just not aware, perhaps, that there is legal obligations that they must follow. The case laws were also really important because some of these laws are just very vague. And so I think it was really important to read through case laws to understand how legal experts will interpret and review these laws. One thing that really shocked me was the years that most of these technical standards in Canada were last reviewed. So if I look at the dates, it was between 2013 to 2021 was the last time that a lot of these schools updated or reviewed, their technical standards, with the average being 2016, 2017. And so when I think about the technology changes that have occurred since then and the understanding of the importance of diversity in the workforce and in education, it kind of really blew my mind that these have not been reviewed since then. So I think we could probably all agree that there is it's time for an update.
Absolutely, absolutely. You know, I love how you worked to balance this committee and the approach that you took. Certainly, you looked through the legal landscape so that everyone could increase their awareness, but you didn't rely solely on the idea of legal obligation to drive change in this area. In fact, you really leaned into the idea of people with disabilities enriching the fabric of medical education, and that their lived experience was really important. And so you talk a lot about the cultural affirmation approach that you took to drive this committee. As learners, both a resident and a medical student, what did it mean to you to see this very big shift in the approach to disability inclusion?
For so long, people with disabilities have not had a seat at the table when these technical standards were discussed, right? Very few, if any, people with disabilities who were impacted substantially were making these rules. And so one of the things that really, we practice what we preached here. So we use the principle of nothing about us without us. The committee had a large representation of people with disabilities, including people who have been impacted by the technical standards themselves. This really underpins so much of the work that we've done, and it allows us to see that legal bar as the lowest level, but then with our expertise and our collaboration, our allies, working together allows us to just supersede that and really lean into this cultural affirmation approach. I think so often, we have so many patients whose lives are impacted by disability. It's extremely important to see providers that look like them, that speak like them, that communicate like them. We take for granted that we grow up seeing people who look like us as teachers, as doctors, as lawyers in society, and we just don't have the representation in medicine, and I think that this is a really important thing that this approach and these technical standards are working to shift.
And I think increasing representation for students with disabilities in medical school also helps those who don't identify as someone with a disability. I think about when I first started medical school and where I'm at now 2 years later, and how much I've learned, not just from the curriculum itself, but from my peers and everyone that I interact with daily. And I think by increasing the representation of people with disabilities in medical school, it allows for open conversation and discussions that will eventually work to dismantle the implicit bias and stigma that a lot of people unfortunately do carry. So, and I think that as we move forward, the students are going to be the ones who are going to move into the workforce and then into educator and advocacy roles in the medical field. And so I think it's really important to have people with disabilities for their lived experience, which is the most important, but then also the influence that it has on the other students as well.
Yeah, we talk a lot about social contact theory and how important it is to be surrounded by people, that it's just that even the proximity to someone who is in partnership with you towards a shared goal reduces bias and reduces stigma and assumptions that we might make about people with disabilities. I love that you now have experienced that. You're on the receiving end of that education and the broadening of your perspective of people with disabilities. Okay, I'm coming back, Dr. Holmes, to you. So one of the first things that we talked about when we started to talk about what you were doing up here in Canada was the timing. And they say timing is everything. The things that I've seen in the US, what was possible prior to COVID-19 and the shift in medical education versus what is possible now is vastly different. And I suspect that the timing of this committee allowed you to really catalyze the work. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, you're right. Timing is everything. Also, people are everything. So the success of this project is really entirely due to all of the people that were so generous with their time and commitment to an open, frank discussion and the inclusive environment that we created, including persons with disabilities, a patient advocate with a disability, and learners. But for sure, the climate for change was catalyzed by the pandemic. I think through the shutdown of COVID-19, we learned how quickly we can pivot our education and workplace practices and how there are so many ways to achieve the same ends. And innovation becomes a necessity. But there were other great things that were drivers for change. I'll just highlight 4 of them. So the first was just the recent changes in legislation and human rights rulings. So the Accessible Canada Act came into place in 2019. So that's very recent. And the legislative and case review that Rachel did was a very compelling piece, especially the summary of the obligations of a faculty of medicine put together by our legal team. Second is just heightened recognition of advances in assistive technology and the idea of universal design. Third is the shared interest and alignment with our accreditation body, the Committee on the Accreditation of Canadian Medical Schools, in revising and updating existing accreditation standards and elements. And then most importantly, and you alluded to this, is just the growing recognition and affirmation of the value of human diversity in society. So just about everybody knows someone with a disability and can identify with the importance of not just inclusion, but belonging.
Julie, I'm going to head back over to you because it strikes me as interesting that when I think about, I've read this document. I had a little preview, and I think, Cheryl, I emailed you immediately and said, this is going to be a game changer. It is a beautifully written document. I think it will be a document that is the envy of medical education globally. I think that you have done something that none of us have been able to do. I know we've been trying in the US to do something similar for 2 decades, and I just cannot wait to share this broadly with our folks and with people globally that are working to make this change. One of the recommendations that you make is to increase transparency, to make sure that technical standards are available on websites, that they are talked about in the orientation, that they're explained to learners. You talked about not even knowing what these were and inadvertently signing them, Julia, and not really having an understanding. What does it mean to see these recommendations and the fact that they'll be implemented across Canada?
It's pretty incredible. So often, or at least when I was going through, you just didn't see very many people with disabilities. So it was hard to ask questions. You had no idea, what the next 3 to 4 years of your life were going to look like. So you didn't know what the challenges were going to be, what the successes were going to be, and namely how to navigate a system that was not built or designed for you, and in fact had many barriers in place to prevent you from being there. So having these technical standards, these core competencies be recommended to be publicly available, to be widely shared and present, it's really saying loudly and proudly that we want people with disabilities in our faculties. We want people with disabilities in medical education. So I think that that's the first piece that is so important. And obviously the AFMC endorsing it is, I can't even describe how important that is and how incredible it is and how much I want to say thank you to them for doing that. It is really impactful and very meaningful for people like me who have been so impacted by technical standards. So often people with disabilities need a huge amount, myself included, needed a huge amount of privilege, mentors, Peter Rosenbaum, Marley Simon, the list goes on, who really stood in corners and advocated for me when I didn't have the skills or the ability to advocate for myself. And I often think about all the learners who didn't have that, who, for various reasons weren't able to do that. So it's really reassuring to me now that we are embracing the diversity of disability and really facilitating more intersectional representation of disability in our medical education environments.
Amazing. So you said something that was my very next question that I think is so critical, and you may not know, but the AFMC endorsed this document that will be widely available soon. And Cheryl, when I think about the work we've done and what it would mean to be endorsed, publicly and so profoundly by the association or by your accreditors, what is the impact of this? What does this do to your document and the ability to realize that across all of the schools?
Well, I think the impact of the endorsement by the deans of all the medical schools in Canada and the AFMC is just such a crucial step in influencing change. And I'm really humbled to be part of an organization that has such a deep commitment to social justice and inclusion in a very demonstrable way. It makes me a bit emotional, actually. And I really hope that by publishing our core competencies and the methodology that we use, we can influence the inclusion of persons with disabilities in health professions education globally, including the United States.
We'll take it. I already have an underground chat going about wait till you see what those Canadians did. It truly is just remarkable.
Yeah.
And Rachel, I want to come back to you because I have to tell you, not many students are going to accidentally get put onto a project to be this involved. I can't imagine any of you anticipated how big this would get and that we would be sitting here today talking about the fact that it's endorsed and it's going to be implemented across every medical school in Canada. I mean, that's just, for me, it's mind-blowing. What does it feel like as a learner to have been part of something that moved policy, shaped policy so profoundly?
I think the AFMC endorsement really demonstrates a genuine understanding for the need for change and the willingness to take steps in order to do so. And as a learner who is just entering my career in medicine, it makes me really excited that there is acknowledgement for change and that everyone is willing to move forward and just make changes that are necessary in order to improve the medical and education fields for many different people.
Can I just say something?
Absolutely.
You know, Rachel, we're just so lucky that the timing of everything, of you coming on board, just the way that you approach this project is part of the success of it. So thank you.
Thank you.
And so many things came out of COVID. I know that you had planned to do something else and then were able to jump onto this. And we had people joining our lab that had things that they were supposed to be doing, and now they are so deeply part of that lab. It's like we would have never experienced all of these things. Working through this, what surprised you the most as you went through this process?
Me first? Well, first, how little I know about everything in general, but about disability inclusion in particular. I was also really surprised how quickly we wrapped up this first goal of our project, which is, again, a testament to the deep commitment to social justice of our organization. Yeah, I think that would be.
I will echo you on that. I also think the thing that surprised me most, actually, is how dissatisfied all stakeholders were in the old technical standards, right? People with disabilities were obviously dissatisfied. I personally was dissatisfied. But educators, administrators, nobody was happy with how they were previously done. They were vague. They were quite restrictive. And they really didn't allow for things that we pride ourselves on in medicine: creativity, problem solving, teamwork, right? Those restrictive technical standards didn't let us do what we do best. So I think, I obviously had a really challenging time going through medical school with the barriers placed by the technical standards, but seeing that we actually all are on the same team in the end. We all want to create excellent doctors, and we want to do so safely and with the good of our patients in mind. So I think that really was such a pleasant shift for me, and has really, it's been really impactful.
I interviewed, as part of our AAMC report, I interviewed a ton of residents and students and physicians with disabilities. And there was a physician, a student at the time, Dr. Kurt Herzer, who said during our interview, and this is in the report, but also Kurt and I have now become fast friends and colleagues. He wouldn't mind me sharing. He said technical standards were neither technical nor standard, and they were the most confusing thing that he had ever encountered. He was an individual with low vision and graduated from Johns Hopkins Medical School, but was told multiple times by U.S. medical schools, don't even apply. You don't meet our technical standards. We don't want to train you. Wow. And yet he became an amazing physician and policy worker. Rachel?
I agree with everything that Julia and Dr. Holmes said. Dr. Haynes, I guess, sorry. And then I will say this was my first time advocating at a policy level, and so I learned a lot of what that means to be able to influence change at a policy level, and things that I'm hoping to take forward as I continue on in my career in medicine. And then I also just learned a lot from everyone on the working group, and everyone brought in different insights and things that I'd never thought about. So I'm incredibly thankful to have been part of this.
Okay, now we're going to ask a question that I think is really interesting. You've done the work, you've created this report that has now been endorsed, and you are working on a publication about the process that you used. So now it's implementation time, right? And so there's more work to be done. Let's imagine we're back. I would love to come back to Vancouver. Let's imagine we're back in Vancouver. It's 2024. We're at an ICAM conference again, and we're talking about how successful this initiative has been, from developing it to broadening it and now to implementing it. What does success look like when we are sitting on the stage in 5 years? What happened in Canadian medical schools as a result of this document that we're all going to be talking about, or that you hope we're talking about?
Well, I think this is the first step, and I think there's many steps to normalize institutional support for persons with disabilities through inclusive learning environments. And so I think, first of all, that every school will have adopted these core competencies for entering medical students through their own governance processes, because we don't govern other medical schools. So they have to be implemented and instituted. I think that there'll be a robust faculty development platform so that everybody is up to speed, and there's quality improvement, evaluating the learner experience on many things, but including accessibility, and evaluating what we've done and what needs to be done next.
I think for me, I joined this project because I realized how much of a barrier technical standards are to students with disabilities. And so one thing that I would love to see in 2029 would be that these technical standards are implemented, and that it's done exactly what everyone hopes it would do, which was remove barriers for students with disabilities. And I also hope it serves as a catalyst for change, because changing the document is one thing, but I think it's important that we influence the broader medical and education systems as well.
So it's a bit funny that you asked us this question. We were going through and preparing, and Lisa posed this question to us, and I said, I have a picture that's worth about 1,000 words here. So the photo that's up right now, in the foreground, you see my path to school. So there's it's the accessible parking, there's a path, and the ramp is on the other side for the entrance to the university. In the background, what you see is a poster that says Imagine 2030. Right, so this was in 2017 to 2021 is when I was in medical school. I am so excited that this will serve as a catalyst for change and a catalyst for allowing students with disabilities to participate in medical education. But meaningful inclusion means that we need to do a lot of work to make our clinical spaces, our education environments, our social environments accessible to people with disabilities. We have a long way to go for that. If everyone who's listening to this or in this room goes around your own clinic space, your own call rooms, your own schools, your anatomy labs, and just takes a simple look to see what is and is not accessible, you'll be quite surprised, actually. So I think in 2030, we will start to see the inclusion of people with disabilities in the fabric of our medical education system, from students to educators to administrators, all the way throughout. And I think as we start to see that, change in the accessibility of spaces will start to be made as well. As these signs have now been taken down and there is a curb cut that has been made. So change does happen, it's slow, but with so many allies like Cheryl, like Rachel, who are coming on board and helping us push forward and make spaces more accessible. I'm really optimistic that being the only person in a medical school in a wheelchair is not going to be the reality for people moving forward.
I'm blown away by both of you, your responses and kind of the call to action and the future vision. And I love what you say about social accessibility as well, because, we're thinking a lot about persons with visible disabilities, but there's so many people with non-visible disabilities, including people who are neurodivergent, and we haven't designed social accessibility for everyone.
What people believe when you're thinking about technical standards is really focused on the physical, the mobility, the sensory disabilities. I believe this is going to be a major catalyst. Tomorrow we have another panel where we'll talk about policy change. We'll talk about research that's driving change in Canada and what the future of medical education might look like if it's accessible, if it's truly accessible and inclusive. So I think this is one of a complete set of dominoes that is going to cascade through Canada with some really good momentum and some really good accessibility. And I'm so just in awe of what you have accomplished here and cannot wait to kind of activate it in the United States, in the UK, and other countries that are really doing a lot of work around this. And I promise to take it with me and to to share it widely with everyone I know. Before we move to the opportunity for people to ask questions, I want to remind you that there is a panel here tomorrow with some leaders in research and medical education. I also want to remind you that this is being recorded live, and so you'll be able to listen to it on our Docs with Disabilities podcast the first week of June, and we'll have both of those panels available for you. And as we move to the Q&A, just a reminder that if you choose to ask a question, you are giving me permission to record your voice and to use that on the podcast. So with that, I'm going to open it up. Quentin is going to be our runner for the microphone. We ask you to definitely use the microphone. If you would like to ask a question and you would like the question to remain private, and you don't want to hear your voice on a podcast, then that's perfectly fine. Just jot down a little note and hand it to Quentin, and Quentin will read it aloud. But this is a lot of knowledge and energy, and just what you've done is so incredible. Can we start with a round of applause for everyone? It's pretty remarkable, and for everyone that was on that working group. All right, who wants to ask the first question? We have one in the back. Quentin?
Thanks so much. Very interesting. My question, the technical standards, I work in faculty development and fairly new to me, and I just kind of discovered them. I would love if maybe each of you would give an example of an edited change that you found significant, I guess, just to get something a little bit concrete. Thank you.
That's a great question. And I know Cheryl's pulling up the document. I will give you a really clear example from the United States. We start often with the communications domain saying something like must be able to hear, and then it goes on to talk about various types of engagements that you might have with your patient. But in reality, what we're asking you to do is to gather information, right? And the ability to hear is not necessarily needed to gain that particular information. So that would be an example that's, I think, a pretty clear-cut example. Cheryl?
This is a great question. So it's a real qualitative shift in describing what are the sensory, motor, and cognitive requirements of a program to describing what actually needs to be done. And so not how to do it, but what needs to be done. We've organized them in 5 domains. The first one is learning and assessment of learning. So we're just letting learners know that they will need to acquire knowledge, skills, and behaviors through a variety of modalities, including classroom instruction, laboratory instruction, cadaveric lab in some cases, small group learning, collaborative activities, provision of patient care in clinical settings, individual study, preparation of reports, and use of technology. So those are all the things that you will need to be doing. We're not telling you how you must do them. And then this is the first time I've seen this in any technical standards. You'll be assessed on the acquisition of knowledge in a number of modalities. So we're talking about work-based assessments, OSCEs, reflective activities, and so on. And then under communication, what we've said is learners will actively communicate, conveying information effectively in person and virtually. So it's not talking about listening, speaking, hearing, all of those things. It's about communicating effectively. Then there's knowledge integration, so it's interpreting information obtained through interview, observation, examination, and medical research. And then patient safety and quality, this one was really hotly debated. So it's about practicing within your level of confidence to recruit or deliver patient-centered care. And so it means participating as a team member in responding to a patient safety situation. So you might not be the person doing the CPR, but you're part of the team delivering that care. So you might be observing team dynamics. You might be ensuring that there's closed loop communication, all of those things. So I hope that that answers your question.
And I wonder, Julie, if you can speak to some of the ones I know that we see broadly in the US must be able to stand and, that sort of thing, which clearly we have so many physicians in the United States that are wheelchair users.
Yeah, the US is really leading the charge on that. I always say that people cannot imagine doing day-to-day activities with one hand. I implore you all to try and tie your hair up with one hand, tie your shoes one-handed, right? But that's a part of my daily life, right? So we, as people without disabilities or without that specific disability, it's really, really hard to imagine how someone could possibly suture, how someone could possibly intubate or start IVs with whatever, disability they do have. So what this document also allows is for a lot of creativity in doing that, and an understanding that you can participate in an OR environment in a wheelchair, and you can do just as good of a job as your peers, if not sometimes better. So I think that it's a really interesting shift to foster creativity and to understand that there are many, many ways to do things successfully.
Thank you. So my name is Jessica Dunkley. I'm a deaf doctor, and I was the first deaf student that got accepted at the University of Ottawa. So when you look at more of a comment, not a question, but just looking at the title, it says Stories Disrupt Bias and Correct the Ableist Narrative. So in the technical standards, it talked about, again, that you must be able to hear. But when you look at the CMPA, when they did a review of all the complaint, the number one complaint was communication. So you're looking at a large number of physicians who are not deaf, and they're struggling with communicating. So again, that was the narrative that I would give to people, and I would say, I'm deaf, but I know how to connect with these patients. And when you have a platform that is really restrictive, saying that you must hear, it really influences people's biases when they work with me. And this technical standard will address those biases so that people will now have something in their hand that is where they can be confident and say, well, it's about communication, it's not about hearing. And that will reinforce the support that we get from allies, and that's really important, and that's what the technical standard, I hope, will be able to do. I also work with sign language interpreters, and that was the other component, because in order for me to communicate successfully, connect with patients successfully, is to also use interpreters in the hospital setting, because the hospital setting is not universally designed for me. I can design my clinic now that I'm out of residency to make it work for me. But right now, as it stands, the hospital is not university designed, so people like myself require extra support and accommodation to ensure that I successfully communicate with patients. So that's my story from the old technical standards of having to hear when it really comes down to communicating.
So much great stuff to unpack there. And I see our UBC curriculum director here, and I'm hoping we can get rid of whispering pectoriloquy and egophony and change it to point-of-care ultrasound to examining the lung.
Hi, my name is Salim Razak, and I was part of some of this work, and it was a real honor and privilege to be part of this work. Just with respect to whispering pectoriloquy, I just need to come clean that I've never heard a diastolic murmur in my life. I thought, oh wow, we're going to have an accommodation framework in terms of as we develop these things. But what I learned, and I would like you to comment on, perhaps to distinguish the accommodation framework a little, is that what's philosophically behind these standards is really a diversity-affirming framework. And I think that that format in medical education is a very, very useful one because it actually ultimately gets to shared humanity and what we in an ecosystem of practitioners that have all kinds of different abilities bring to this organism known as medicine that has to enact a collective job. So I wonder if you can comment a little on the idea of diversity affirming or disability affirming versus accommodation.
Probably not as well as you can, Salim. You speak so well on this area, and I learned so much from you.
Well, what I said is what I said, but no, but I think really what's important is this notion that we are a collectivity enacting the job. We belong to teams, quite apart from the presence or absence of a disability, which is a social choice. You know, it's different in different contexts and all that stuff. We need help. We need help when we don't know something. We need help when we can't do something, and that I think is like an important curricular message to pass on.
And I do think it's important. I think you've hit on something really critical, which is that, we're talking about technical standards today. Tomorrow in our panel, we'll be talking about accommodation and accommodation systems. But when we rely on accommodations as the solution to equity, we are continuing to other individuals. What is the social barrier? What is the physical barrier? What's the curricular barrier that's happening that is causing an individual to engage with our environment and find barriers? We'll never eradicate accommodation completely. I think that we need to stop thinking about accommodation as the gold standard, and we need to think about how to shift medical education into a more flexible system that loads on various types of learning, various types of needs, and build a system that is a little bit more humane, if I'm being honest. Yeah, so thank you so much for that contribution. Do we have other questions? Bonnie.
Okay. I'm Bonnie Sawatsky from UBC. And my question is, one of the things that we have now at UBC is this motto is transforming health for everyone. And so transforming health, what does that actually look like? And so when I look at these standards now being changed and improving accessibility for people with disabilities into our medical school program, so now I'm actually involved with the architecture, and they call me when we're talking about any new builds or edit changes to any hospitals in British Columbia. But I keep getting told that only when they're exclusively for medical learners is that environment have to be accessible. When do you see us actually changing the whole system so that patients with disabilities, you know, I'm a medical educator, but I'm also a patient. And so when I can't get on an exam table, what does that look like? So how does the medical learner, so where will we see this transformative health for everyone actually happen? And where do you see this going from the Ministry of Education to the Ministry of Health?
I don't know about in Canada, but there are 3 billion people with disabilities globally, and 1 in 4 in the United States. That means our students are going to engage with disabled patients every day, all day, across many clinical types. If we're serious about reducing healthcare disparities for people with disabilities, the first thing we need to be able to do is deliver healthcare. When we have these inaccessible environments, when we have barriers to getting to our health systems, when we are treating people with disabilities as though they're a tax or a burden in our healthcare system, we are not delivering good healthcare. So I think that is, first and foremost, is just to take this very seriously for everyone.
Yeah, Bonnie, I would say it's the Accessible Canada Act, 2019. So every institution is held to that accountability, that all persons must have a barrier-free access to full and equal participation, and that includes laws, policies, programs, services, and structures. So it's for everyone. It's for patients, for staff, for faculty, for learners. So I'm sorry to hear that this is the message that you're getting from our institutions. They need to be educated, obviously.
I think one thing that's pretty critical too is, you know, when we just do the legal standard, people will find the absolute minimum that is allowed, right? The absolute minimum. So that might be 1 accessible patient room in an entire hospital. It will probably not mean accessible call rooms, right? Or accessible staff areas, because obviously staff don't need those spaces, right? Said sarcastically. So I think when we start to see this disability affirming, cultural affirmation approach as part of the fabric and the culture within healthcare, that's when I think those will start to see priority be for things to be accessible. But people will find, if you set the bar low, people will sink to it. But when we set the bar high and we set an expectation that all people will be able to access this, we can rise to that occasion, right? We can rise and make spaces accessible.
And I just want to point out that spaces, curricula, all of the things that go into medical education and medical care are created by people. Who has been creating these spaces for generations and generations and generations? It's not disabled physicians. When we start to infuse the workforce with disabled physicians, disabled nurses, disabled OTs and PTs, people like Julia will become, I hope, academic leaders, will take leadership roles as they progress in their career, will be the people making decisions about what equipment we order, what we do about building renovation, what we do about medical education curricula, right? People that have experience with individuals with disabilities and know that people with disabilities can thrive will question the status quo. This, I promise you, Dr. Holmes is very, very humble, but I promise you this started with her looking at this and probably saying to herself, this doesn't make any sense, right? Because she knew better. She had that personal experience and knew what a person with a disability could do. So it's change makers. It's people that will come into the system and start to develop a different system. But when we look historically at who's been in charge, and this cuts across all DEI initiatives, right? It's people make policy. People build buildings. It's not, we talk about structural barriers. I would argue the structural barriers start with people. Right? But the good news is, if we build it, we can tear it down. If we've created it, we can change it. So,
Love that. Thanks, Bonnie, and thanks for all the advocacy that you do it has an effect. I hope that you know that.
And you do it with humor, and it's so fun. So thank you for that. Quentin is doing a wonderful job.
That's
For
right.
our listeners, Quentin Clark is our amazing runner today.
Woo! So thank you. First of all, congratulations on this achievement. For those of us who kind of like are in the inside, we know how transformative this work has been, and it's not easy. It's usually up to those of us who have the lived experience to advocate for ourselves. So even though we are 27% of the population in Canada, not everybody has the privilege to out themselves if they have a non-visible disability. There's too much at risk, losing your job, losing your opportunities as a physician or as a learner. So we need allies. Yeah. So what I wanted to ask is about how will these new standards, or if is there any mechanism to affect or maybe mitigate, eliminate the attitudinal barriers? Because it's not just non-disabled people who create the systems and the curriculums and the standards, but it is what their mindset is. And now that there's this change, those who have to implement it, are they going to be willing to, or you have to actually, I don't know, carrot and stick kind of situation?
I think Rachel is an outstanding example of someone who came in and is now, such an ally for people with disabilities. And I think the more we do this work, the more, people, like you said, that have disabilities within the fabric of medicine, the easier it is to make allies, right? And make friends.
I will say, I go into clinics now, and the first thing I do is, like Julia said, is I walk in and I see all the barriers. And that's something that I would never have done, just because, not because I was, trying to avoid it, but I just wasn't sure, or didn't know any better at that point. And so coming on and educating myself on starting with the technical standards and then moving into abroad and talking to my classmates who have disabilities, I've just learned so much from them and their personal stories. And it's totally changed the way that I see disability and I see people with disabilities in general. And I will always now walk into spaces and think about that. And so I think it is really important to increase the number and the representation of people with disabilities from all types of different disabilities in general, just so that people can start learning from their peers and their colleagues.
Yeah, and I just want to give a shout out to our University of British Columbia faculty development people, because we held a retreat a year ago, and we had a workshop on disability inclusion and accommodations, and they put together some wonderful cases that were the groundwork for discussion. And it just brought everybody in our organization up to the same level of understanding. We saw attitudes shift in an afternoon. And a big part of that was you, Julia, sharing your stories about clerkship. And so inclusion of the stories of people with lived experience, I think, is really profound. And I can't say enough about the Docs with Disabilities podcasts. And I've listened to so many of them now, and that has really helped shift my thinking. Listen to the podcast, spread the word, get people listening and talking about it. Put on some faculty development at your institution or some CPD. Let's share and borrow shamelessly from each other. I think it starts one person at a time and listening to people with lived experience.
Thank you so much for your amazing work and advocacy and for this great presentation. I'm curious how you see incorporating neurodiversity, neurodivergent people, especially people who are using an identity-first model, in a system where people need to self-identify as being disabled in order to access this, in order to have their needs met.
My thought is that the more accessible and understanding and compassionate we can make our spaces, I think it allows for fewer accommodations needing to be made, and thereby forcing fewer people to out themselves and self-identify. Our environments make disability where there doesn't need to be, right? We ask people to do 26-hour call. We force people to do, so many things that are outside of this realm of what is considered normal life for most human beings. And so people who don't necessarily identify as having a disability then have to out themselves in so many spaces. So I think the more accessible we can make our environments broadly, the better we will be able to serve people who do use an identity-first model, who don't opt into this, the disability accommodation-based system.
We thank you so much for your time. I encourage you, if you are a podcast person, listen to our podcast, Docs with Disabilities. Interesting fact, our entire campaign, the hashtag Docs with Disabilities, was co-created with a Canadian. No big surprise there. Shout out to Pam Liao for coming up with this brilliant idea with me so long ago. And we encourage you to follow us on social media. If you have social media, if you don't, good for you. Right? I mean, I even hate saying it because we really should all get off. Maybe that's what we do. I'll get off social media and think a little bit more. But if you do have it and you are inclined to scroll, Docs with on X. Can we get one more round of applause for the incredible work done by this group? We hope to see you tomorrow, and keep a lookout for this episode to come out. And thanks so much to ICAM for the invitation, and to AFMC for the support. Thank you so much.
Wow, what an incredible experience. Thank you for being such a welcoming group, and we encourage you to listen to our other panel on research in Canadian medical education. We extend our heartfelt gratitude to the Association of Faculties of Medicine of Canada, or AFMC, for inviting us to host 2 live Docs with Disabilities Initiative panels at the International Congress on Academic Medicine. We also wish to thank our wonderful panelists and the incredible audience in Vancouver for their very warm welcome. This podcast is a production of the Docs with Disabilities Initiative and is supported in part by the University of Michigan Medical School, Department of Family Medicine, and Disability Initiative, the Stanford Medicine Alliance for Disability Inclusion and Equity, and the Ford Foundation. The opinions expressed on this podcast do not necessarily reflect those of the hosts, their respective institutions, or our funders. This podcast is released under a Creative Commons Attribution, Non-Commercial, Non-Derivative license. This episode was produced by me, Lisa Meeks, and Jacob Feeman.